Now, let's start with the part 2 of this step where we are adding in the command object. In the previous part, we added in the command bean. So now let's focus on adding the validations. As we discussed earlier, we are going to use JSR 349 validations, which are defined by Hibernate Validator framework. We're going to use a bean validation API. I mean, a lot of specifications, but actually it's really simple. So let's get started with it. What I want to do is when user types in something, I want to validate that. In true, I want to validate the value which the user is entering. So how do I do that? The way we can validate is by using something called a bean validation API. I would want to have a size of at least a certain thing. So I'm adding in at size. It's in JavaX validations. We are making use of that. And I'm going to use an attribute. The attribute is min. So I'm saying it should be minimum of 6. If it's not minimum of 6, I would want to give a message. Enter at least 6 characters. So now this is a validation that I'm adding in on the description field. So I want this validation to be executed on this description field every time this field is set with a value. So how do I enforce that? If you look at the size, it's part of a validation constraints which we already have as part of the Java EE API. So we are getting this validation API for free, but we don't get the validation API implementation for free. What we need first before we use these validations is an implementation of these validations. And Hibernate Validator is an implementation of this particular validation. So let's go ahead and start with adding Hibernate Validator to our pom.xml. So we need Hibernate Validator jar in our code to be able to use this. So let's go ahead and do that. Pom.xml. This is more important than log4j. I'll put it more about web jars, I think. Yeah, I think this is good place. So I'll add it in. I could have added it in anywhere in the pom.xml within the dependencies. That should have been fine, but I like to be really specific with where I add things in. So that's good. Now whenever we change a jar, we need to restart the server. So let's go ahead and restart the server. We have added a validation API restriction on the description field. So this is the restriction we wanted to add on the description field, and that's done. Now, what we want to make use of also is the Hibernate Validator implementation. Hibernate Validator is the reference implementation of Java Validation API. So that's why we have included the implementation of Hibernate Validator in here. Now everything looks good. So now we have a validation defined on to-do. We have Hibernate Validator in the jar, Hibernate Validator jar in the class path. The next thing we would need to do is to actually execute the validation. So when user does a submit, it goes to add to do post method. So here I would want the validation to be executed. So I would want the validations to be run in here. How do I cause the validations to be run? There is another validation. So another annotation, sorry. So just type in @valid and this would cause the validation to be triggered. Whenever we do some validation, we would get some results from it. So if we want to access the results of the validation, we would need to add in another parameter to this method. The parameter is called binding result. So binding result is basically when the binding happens, if there are any validation errors, that's what are put into binding results. So I'm going to use the interface binding result and I'll say result. What I want to do is if there are any validation errors, so if there are validation errors, then what I should do is I would need to return the user back to which page? I need to return back the user to to-dos page, because I would want the user to fix the validation errors before I would be able to proceed further. So if I'm entering a validation error, I have to fix it. So if there is a validation error, I would want to return the user back to which page? To the to-do page. So the way we do that is by saying result dot has errors. If result has errors, if there are errors in the binding result, then return back to the to-do page. So let's see what would happen now. Also, I would remove the default description. To summarize the changes which we have done. 1. We added at size min is equal to 6. on the to-do bean. Number two, we added in the Hibernate validator jar, which is the reference implementation of the Java EE validation API, into the pom.xml so that the jar is available for us. The third thing which we did is we went to the to-do controller and we added in an annotation at valid. As soon as we put at valid, the validations are run on to-do, and the results of these validations are stored into something called a binding result, and that's what we are capturing here. That's the fourth thing which we did. The fifth thing which we did is we added in this if condition. We are checking if the results has errors, return to do. So that's all we have done in this step until now. Let's go and run the application now. So now let's refresh. So the default value has disappeared. I'm entering only 4 characters, ERTY. Aha, that's good. So now we are getting an error. So what it's saying is there is no default constructor found on the to-do. One of the important things about the command beans is when you want to tie to them, Spring MVC does not know about the different constructors which are present in there. So the only thing it knows is the default constructor. So I would need to create a default constructor on it. So let's go ahead and create a simple empty constructor. So let's just save it. Let's now refresh, go back and type add again. When I click add with 4 characters, I see that we are returning back to the same page, but we are not yet showing the validation error. The message is not coming up. Why is the message not coming up? Let's go and see the JSP. So let's quickly look at the todo.jsp. We have a form label, we have a form input, but we need something called a form error to show the error as well. What we would be using is form errors. Path is equal to which fields errors has to be shown here, and I'm adding a CSS class of text warning. Let's run this again. Now you have an error shown in here. So it says enter at least 6 characters. So QERTY, enter at least 6 characters. QWERTY, that's good. And now the to do is added in. So you see QWERTY in here. So what you can do now is you can play around with the Hibernate validations in here. There are a lot of validations that we can add on the objects using Hibernate validation. The Java validation API specify a number of constraints on size. You can see all the important constraints. It says assert false. The value should always be false. The value should always be true. For a decimal value, what is the max? For a decimal value, what is the minimum value that can be assigned in there? How many digits can it have? And also, it should always be in future. This is more for date classes. And you have a max, min on the size. I mean, that's basically, here we have the size which we are using right now. And you can have a max, a min. You can say not null. Some value should always be not null. So, and it should always be in the past. A date should always be in the past. Those are all the constraints that we can add in using the JavaX validation. So that's the validation API. So we tried a simple validation in here. I would really recommend you to try adding more validations on the description and try seeing how it goes. In this step, we started with using a command bean for the to do. That's in the previous part. In this part, we started adding the validations. We added the Hibernate validator jar, and then we added the @valid annotation and also the binding result, and we checked the results. And as a last step, we started displaying the errors on the screen as well. That's a lot of ground that we covered in this step. If you have any questions, I would really recommend you to go through this step again and see if those questions are answered. Let's get together in the next step.